yeah, well, you should definitely consider starting up your very own intelligence agency here. Also, you could look into things like various types of scientific salons and so on, maybe also on Little St. James. Then she writes here in parentheses, experimentation with philosophers and scientists. So, conducting experiments on isolated and remote islands. Yeah, philosophy, science, and discovering more about various complex physiological processes. And at the very end of her message, she also writes, how about high-profile island orgies? That is, island orgies with very wealthy and influential people. And then she writes here, but I have a strong suspicion that you may already have that covered.
Hello, dear friends of the truth. Today, believe it or not, I have Frank Hofer as a guest on my show for the very first time. Hello, Frank.
Hey there, Ollie. Is that so? Yeah.
Well, I can't recall a time when you were ever on my show before. I've been on Nuiso on your show many times, but I think this is the first time it's the other way around. And the reason is that you've written a book. Since I might want to translate it into English because I haven't found anything like it in the English speaking world, I want to start by mentioning that you used to work for state broadcasting, right? Our international viewers don't know that. So in Germany, there's public broadcasting. No idea how the AI will translate that now. And the Germans are forced to pay for their own propaganda. I think it's 8 billion a year or something like that. So tell us briefly what it was like there. And did you already notice back then that you were lying to people all the time?
Yeah, that was a very, very long time ago. I served a full apprenticeship from the year 2001 all the way through to 2004, which was right in those early years following the tragic events of September 11th. That was truly a significant wake-up moment for me. And all of those things eventually came together. And 8 years later, in 2009, led me to leave the world of public broadcasting and basically try to embark on the long journey of building my own independent thing on YouTube. That is exactly what I have been doing ever since. And yes, as you mentioned, I also wrote a book recently, which I actually had not done before. And I did not do it just so I could finally say I have written a book, but because, as you just said, you could not find anything on this topic. And that is what it is really about. And that really surprised me too. And I thought to myself, well, okay, to be perfectly honest, I should just compile all of this information together into one place. And in the end, the collection of material was actually so extensive that it was enough for a book.
Very good. Yes, and you are one of the best-known alternative media entrepreneurs, I would say. So for those who don't know, internationally, you do a lot of shows with many different guests, including me. So let's dive right into the topic now. So the book is called The Brooklyn Project or Das Brooklyn Project. I hadn't heard of it before either. Then I watched your show about it and already found it very interesting. So first, tell us how you came across it, and then we'll get into the details.
Well, I came across it in the week after the release of the Epstein files in February 2026. There was a lot of coverage about it. Of course, it was all very exciting. But the coverage then very rapidly began to focus almost exclusively on all the various abuse scandals, on the famous names, luxury villas, and so on. And I then started to spend quite a lot of time digging around and investigating those files myself. And I Googled Bill Gates and all those other names that were constantly being mentioned in the media reports. And then there was a specific report from Bild TV. They reported that Jeffrey Epstein, among a wide variety of other strange and disturbing things, actually planned to create a Neanderthal baby. And that was entirely distinct and separate from everything else that was being reported about him. And I found that to be absolutely fascinating. And so I then began searching specifically for Neander. I wanted to read this email myself. And then I saw that it was an email from Martin Nowak to Jeffrey Epstein, who met with Svante Pääbo in Leipzig to obtain this Neanderthal sequence, and then suggested to Jeffrey Epstein that together with George Church, they could now, at least from a theoretical standpoint, create this Neanderthal baby. So, and then I already had a bunch of names: George Church, Martin Nowak. I just became deeply fascinated by them, and I continued to research and meticulously read through all of their email correspondence. I quickly came across other names like Joshua Bach and Ben Goertzel, and then I looked at their email exchanges as well. And then I came across something quite specific. I can also show it to you and put it up right here on the screen, a particular email that I found to be absolutely fascinating and quite revealing. This email is from the year 2007. In it, Marvin Minsky writes, he was one of the legendary founding fathers of artificial intelligence who originally coined the famous term artificial intelligence at the historic Dartmouth conference back in 1956. He writes an email to Epstein's assistant, Leslie Croft, with the subject Brooklyn Project. And he says there that Hal Abelson would like to become the director of this project. So, and then I thought to myself, wait a minute, there are so many facts and pieces of information here. I need to sort this out somehow. What is the Brooklyn Project? Who is Marvin Minsky? Who is Hal Abelson? And so on and so forth. And that was the initial foundational starting point. And then I also had this specific research search term, the Brooklyn Project. And it was really absolutely fascinating and incredibly detailed what kind of information surfaced and was revealed as a result.
Yeah, then go ahead and explain what is the Brooklyn Project.
Well, the Brooklyn Project, you could basically, you'd really have to go into a lot of detail to explain it properly. I then found a project plan from 2007, which Marvin Minsky and Hal Abelson, both of whom were professors at MIT at the time, had formulated, where they basically presented a 6-year project plan for the creation of artificial intelligence. Yeah, that was the plan in 2007. I already found that very interesting. 2007 was almost 20 years ago. Back then, they were already talking in quite concrete terms about what they intended to do. But it turned out that this collaborative work, together with colleagues Marvin Minsky and Hal Abelson, obviously didn't really satisfy Epstein. It was just far too academic and institutional for his liking. Things moved slowly. And that's why in 2008, he got in touch with Ben Goertzel. Way back in 2001, through the Epstein Foundation, he had already financed Goertzel's extensive studies in Mexico. But at that time, they didn't really know each other very well, having met only once or twice before. But interestingly, when Epstein reached out to him once again, Goertzel responded quite enthusiastically, almost in a detailed novelistic style. Among other things, he mentioned that he actually had an exciting discussion with his professors and AI researchers about Epstein's old idea of an AI Manhattan project. Yeah. So obviously, they had already talked about this back in 2000, 2001. And now in 2008, the discussion between Goertzel and Epstein on this topic is being revived, which is really fascinating. So,
yeah, maybe we should briefly mention that the Manhattan Project was a huge project for the development of atomic bombs involving thousands of people. So calling it that is quite a statement, you know.
yeah, especially since they themselves referred to it in that historical context. So they said that this Brooklyn Project for the creation of artificial intelligence is no less historically significant than the Manhattan Project itself. And after all, the Manhattan Project was almost, well, it was completely secret for over 20 years. I think it wasn't until the 70s that the first publication about it appeared, and there were over 100,000 people involved under the need to know principle who kept it secret for 20 years. And
you could say that both projects or technologies have the potential to destroy humanity. So in that sense, the comparison fits.
yes, basically that's what it is. So Goertzel also tells Epstein very clearly, listen, these famous professors you're working with, Minsky, Abelson, and so on, they won't be able to pull it off. Do it with me instead and give the money to me, right? So outside the institution of MIT, just on the private market. And in these emails, he promises them all sorts of things. He asks him if he knows Aubrey de Grey, who has these philosophical ideas about life extension. And he writes here, hey, we can cure the disease of aging, right? Essentially, what we are doing is creating a sophisticated and autonomous artificial intelligence researcher who is capable of solving all of these complex problems. Yes, they even described dying as a disease that needs to be cured. Well, and so Goertzel and Epstein went down this path together, exchanging a lot of ideas about it. Yes, Epstein also writes to him. Sorry.
Did you also see in the emails whether they only want this life extension or the curing of dying just for themselves, or because in another place they say, how do we get rid of the poor? Is it also part of these discussions that they want this more for the elite?
So this Brooklyn Project initiative was carefully organized and structured according to the need to know principle. That's why it's important to consider the motivation of the innermost circle. And there are really only a handful of names to mention in the end. Epstein, Goerzel, Bach, those three are the ones I would mention. You definitely got the strong sense that they really wanted to develop this technology for themselves, for the elite, and for their own benefit, yes. And it was certainly not for the benefit of all humanity. That would at best just serve as a convenient argument to help justify it if they ever had to. But it's very clear from that one, two, well, not even in the sense that they were aiming for it, but rather Bach often gave Epstein an analysis saying, that's how it's going to happen, you know? For example, Bach told Epstein, listen, the entire scientific community worldwide is focused on calculating the tipping point. When will the system tip over? That would be a total and absolute waste of resources. So that is exactly what Epstein recommended. You should concentrate all of your available resources on post-apocalyptic science because it really does not make any difference at all when the tipping point actually comes, right? And it's no longer a question of whether the tipping point will come, but rather who will have the best ideas and solutions after the tipping point. So, for example, growing food should no longer be possible for ecological reasons. He worked a lot with the Rockefeller Foundation and with Acqui, what's it called? In the field of agriculture, he worked closely with Caleb Harper and John de la Parra, conducting research alongside them, so to speak. He chose to invest his capital into the world of DNA modification, specifically targeting the animal market to improve animal health and wellness. His goal was to ensure animals can be utilized more effectively and potentially live much longer, healthier lives through these advancements. And of course, this is also applicable to the lives of humans, so that you can provide yourself with various life extending measures and basically meticulously design your future children and offspring the way you want, with all the desirable and positive characteristics. And of course, this technology is not available to the rest of humanity, only for those who can afford it. So that was definitely the mindset in that direction. And the fact that all of this wasn't just empty talk is also shown, as I said, by the emails. They're still discussing this in their initial email exchange, where Epstein says, yeah, you know, I've been thinking about the Brooklyn Project again for a while now. I've funded a bit of AI research so far, but none of it was really interesting. Edelman, Minsky, Abelson, and so on. Yeah, to be perfectly honest, I am actually thinking about offering a prize to someone who can actually build me a thinking machine. And Gersel, well, he completely bites. Yeah. He says the Brooklyn Project is long overdue and forget about these Minsky, Edelman, Abelson guys. They have no idea. Yeah. And this idea of the prize, well, that's something we need to discuss further. So they're having a pretty intense exchange here, and I don't really want to go into all the details right now. I'll be giving a much more detailed talk about this very soon. But then Birzel writes to him here saying the goal should be to create an AI scientist who can solve all these problems much better and significantly faster than we ever can, right? Once you have created a creator greater than the human mind, all sorts of other incredible things become possible. So that is exactly the direction their thinking was going.
And Ben Goerzel and Joscha Bach, are they both German?
Joscha Bach is German, but Ben Goerzel is not German. He probably has some German roots or something, but he is not German himself.
Do you know if this Joscha Bach is of Jewish descent? Because that would be especially ironic if he were, so to speak, a non-Jewish German, because then you can see that the elites basically don't care. The main thing is that they can subjugate others. Do you know that?
Yes and no. So that probably doesn't apply to Joscha Bach. Epstein obviously brought him in simply because he has such an incredibly unique and crazy mind. So from that perspective, it was actually relatively agenda free. I mean, well, the connection is, of course, clearly there. But if you are looking at it in the context of other stories, then yes, it is certainly there. With the program project, in fact, it's something where the selection of personnel was obviously based on what people were capable of and their professional talents and not which religion they belong to.
Well, but the billionaires there, they spoke very disparagingly about Goyim and so on. But in that context, it seems they didn't care who they were working with. how much transhumanism is involved there. So was there also talk about directly connecting humans with machines? Because it's one thing to develop AI and another thing to combine both.
Yes, absolutely. I think I'll address that specific point in just a moment. That's when things start to get significantly more serious. So we're now in the years 2007, 2008. These are basically the periods when he was trying to put together a team. He then also asked Ben Goertzel, who can you recommend to me? Who should be involved in the project? Goertzel then proceeds to send him over a list of 10 names. And Epstein responds by saying, okay, now you reach out and write a message to these 10 people and request from every single one of them a list of 10 more names, right? And they're not allowed to, no crosstalk, no cheating. Everyone has to make their own list, and then we'll see who the really important people are. And that's how they set up this project. And right at the very top of Goertzel's list was Joscha Bach. And that's how he got in touch with him. But before that, I'd really like to tell a brief but very revealing personal anecdote to show what kind of significant standing Epstein had. Because, well, back in 2009, he was actually put in jail. He actually got 18 months back then, not on probation, but he was officially sentenced to 18 months. He negotiated the Non-Prosecution Act with John Acosta, which basically meant full immunity from prosecution and a complete halt to all investigations for all the people around him if he made a full confession, for which he ultimately got 18 months. It turned out that after just 2 months, he was already allowed 12 hours of day release every day to go to work. And after 13 months, he was ultimately released. Well, to be honest, that is actually connected in some way to this Rothstein Ponzi scheme. But it is an entirely separate and distinct issue altogether. Yes, and particularly interesting is this email here from June 2009. At that time, Jeffrey Epstein was still in prison. And here John Brockman writes, one of the most well-known, biggest and wealthiest publishers in the USA, who publishes all the science magazines and founded the Edge Foundation, where he, so to speak, regularly hosts exclusive billionaire dinners with prominent figures such as Larry Page, Jeff Bezos, Daniel Hillis, and many others. And this email was about the comprehensive organization of the significant upcoming events scheduled in August 2009. You can see up here Daniel Hillis, George Dyson, Jeff Bezos, Daniel Kahneman. I know that Larry Page is hidden under one of these black bars, and also Jeffrey Epstein. And now John Brockman writes, hey, the next event is happening here in August. And I'm asking you, what exactly should Nathan talk about? He means Nathan Myhrvold, who had just recently been invited to the event. And then he writes the following. What should this Nathan talk about now? And he suggests that he give a 2-hour lecture on astrophysics. So the organizer, the great publisher, John Brockman, who is writing to Larry Page, Jeff Bezos, and all these people, basically has a question, hey, what should it be about? At the next event, Jeffrey Epstein actually writes back a response from prison saying, I still prefer my original Brooklyn project. So he says, listen to me for a moment. You have so many incredibly brilliant and talented minds here. Rather than letting them shine side by side, why not have them all collaborate and work together on one goal, on a problem? Actually, it is quite a logical and sensible approach, but it also clearly demonstrates the pecking order, the hierarchy. From prison, he is the one who decides the topic of John Brockman's next conference with Jeff Bezos and Larry Page. So I personally find that to be exceptionally revealing. And there were quite a substantial number of such meetings occurring, especially at the Institute of Martin Nowak, whom we see here at the very top. Right here, they're engaged in a conversation at this very moment. Right now about a...
Can you say again in brief, what exactly is Martin Nowak's position?
So Martin Nowak is an Austrian evolutionary biologist. This individual was someone who, with the help of Epstein, that is sponsored by Epstein, was able to secure a prestigious professorship at Harvard. And then he founded his own institute there, where Epstein could come and go exactly as he pleased. He had his own personal key card and held a private conference there every Sunday. Well, not every single Sunday, but always on Sundays, with all these prestigious MIT researchers, distinguished Harvard professors, and the various heads of the MIT Media Lab. And also with influential people like Gary Gensler, Larry Summers, John Reed, or even Peter Thiel. So they met there at Martin Nowak's Specialized Institute for Evolutionary Dynamics. He essentially provided the necessary institutional platform and the physical location for these high-level gatherings. for the Brooklyn Project, you could say.
Are there among those involved also suspicious emails regarding underage girls or something like that? Or is that strictly not the case?
It certainly looks suspicious, but it is not yet easy to interpret clearly. You know those specific pizza codes? They also appear, quite interestingly, in the work with Martin Nowak. His personal urologist, a man named Harry Fish, with whom Jeffrey Epstein regularly stored sperm, once sent him a rather peculiar email that said, "Oops, I forgot the appointment. When were we supposed to meet tomorrow for grape soda and thingamajig?" Of course, that is quite a strange and cryptic email, but it's ambiguous, and it was not the main focus of my work at the time. It comes up from time to time, but it was by no means the main topic. We can certainly come back to that at the end of the show. Let's ask the question again about abuse and to what extent that might somehow be explained by the Brooklyn Project. But I want to show you this email here from Martin Nowak with Epstein. There were constant discussion threads in these emails. So you find some emails where there are already 100 replies underneath. So that was like the 1,000th reply to whatever else. And there were always a lot of fascinating, interesting people involved. And as for the ultimate goal, let's jump ahead. The goal was to create an AI scientist who, so to speak, essentially researches immortality. To put it in one sentence. And to accomplish that, you have to make the body immortal and also the mind with the body like this. There are approaches like those of Dmitry Itskov and all the robotics, all the cloning technology, life extending measures, and so on. That's the physical material aspect. The mind, of course, is a completely different challenge. In order to make the mind storable, you first have to understand what the mind actually is. What is consciousness? And that's the most fascinating question of the Brooklyn Project, because they've been trying for decades to find out what is consciousness. And then there are these continual and seemingly endless discussions. Like, for example, Martin Nowak says that consciousness actually only arises through a complex internal dialogue within the mind, a constant ongoing deliberation and weighing of various pros and cons. This inner conversation, ultimately, that's what creates your consciousness, your entire internal world of thoughts and perceptions. That was Martin Nowak's approach, and he writes about it here as well. I love this idea that there is no self-deception, only some internal discussion. And Epstein writes in response, yes, it goes even further. In certain situations, you can actually see this inner conversation in everyone. This leads to phenomena such as the development of split personalities, hearing voices, or even schizophrenia. And then Corinna Tarnita joins in, referencing the famous Milgram experiment, where this split, this inner conflict, and this intense internal struggle also becomes very visible. Because people became extremely nervous, started laughing uncontrollably, and broke out in a cold, nervous sweat, since an imposing authority figure in a professional white coat had given them a direct order. But it creates an absolute overwhelming dilemma, because you, as a direct result, by following the order, by carrying out the command, you cause someone enormous harm, maybe even kill them. And yet many people still did it. And interestingly, that's exactly what they discussed with each other, because the question, very briefly, there's nothing more about that, because with dual personalities, so he probably means split personalities. He could have been well informed and knowledgeable about that, MK Ultra and so on, depending on how early he started. But he never actually brought that subject up in a direct manner. So the others failed to realize, yeah, he tortured people to split them or something like that. But yes, they talked about that quite openly. They asked, how can we map consciousness? How can we understand it? Ideally, even store it. And for that, they themselves came to the realization that first we have to understand what consciousness actually is. We fundamentally have to answer the question, is consciousness local or non-local? That's where it all begins. Is consciousness stored in the brain, or is our brain just an antenna for a kind of central storage? That's what they wanted to understand first. For example, they also questioned this in savant research. So in the outermost fringes and boundaries of consciousness, in the phenomena of consciousness, they tried to become significantly smarter. So they didn't just try to map consciousness in an autonomous way, but they tried it with savants, with people who had split personalities, or with individuals who were exposed to absolute stress situations and extreme environments. So it was authority versus inner conflict, so to speak. And they also experimented extensively in order to gain deeper insights and understanding there. So Zoro Range and isolated remote islands were used for this purpose. In my opinion, mainly for the purpose of researching and subjugating certain scientists, certain exceptionally brilliant minds, and also for acquiring deeper scientific knowledge. For example, it is a well-established fact that if you subject an individual to extreme physical or psychological torture, or put them in a Milgram-like situation, you can conduct wonderful consciousness studies, or rather, I would call them behavioral studies, where you can ultimately derive significant and meaningful conclusions about consciousness. And that was their goal. So it could be that, among other reasons, he recorded everything in order to conduct this study, not just for blackmail. You're probably talking about the massage parlor in Manhattan. Yes, in general. There were cameras everywhere, and the main purpose was probably blackmail, but of course, you could also use it for such experiments. Rather, a test laboratory, and at the same time, they were also actual test subjects. That actually makes the whole thing make a bit more sense, in my opinion. Yes, both from their perspective, but in any case, it's an additional aspect that probably very few have considered, that it wasn't just for blackmail. Here we have an email from 2010. So Gersel spent 2 years trying to persuade Epstein. He kept asking him to finally give him the money because Minsky and Abelson and all the MIT people and also Martin Novak, they just can't do it. Gersel knows how it's done. And he even writes to him on his birthday, January 20th, 2010, saying, hey, if you want to celebrate 10,000 more birthdays, then give me the cash and I'll solve your problem of mortality. So Gersel was very, very convinced of himself. And then things got started right away. So he told him, now let's get started here. Now take a look at this Joshua Bach. This is the email I mentioned earlier about the Neanderthal genome. I already talked about it earlier. Here is an interesting email from Jean-Luc Brunel, also a convicted sex offender in France, who allegedly committed suicide in prison. He sends him an interesting book here in 2012 by Sebastian Zorn called Das Connectum. That was in 2012. Absolute pseudoscientific nonsense, if you think about it. Yeah, those crackpots. By now, that's actually the latest state of research, because recently the fruit fly connectome was successfully simulated. I'm not going to go into that in detail now, right? I really have to explain this concept quite briefly, primarily because I don't fully know exactly what it is yet. The connectome is, so to speak, the fundamental neural structure of our minds. So if you were to take a human brain and carefully remove all of the surrounding tissue, the water, and so on, what you would have left is just the complex network of neurons and their synapses. That's the connectome. And in a fruit fly, that's still, I don't know, 50 million neurons and 150,000 synaptic connections between the neurons. And now, at least for the time being, this has been simulated virtually. But there are also companies that have offered to do this for real. I'll get to that in a moment. Nectomy, for example, where Sam Altman is one of the few customers. So this is the connectome of the fruit fly. Here it was from October 18th, 2024. That's when it was first reconstructed. And I believe in April of this year or March of this year, they then simulated it on a computer. So they handed over this newly reconstructed digital model to a computer and simply allowed the simulation to run freely. And it behaved like a fruit fly. Amazing. Yes, that's what happened here. March 26th, Eon uploads fruit fly brain and it works. Amazing. So that's exactly it. The research that Epstein was involved in, he, along with his entire team, were already working on this project 15 years ago. Here we have an email from David Hansen from Hansen Robotics, where, by the way, Ben Goertzel was the chief architect, the chief scientist. And here Ben Goertzel writes, for example, regarding his list of smart people he was supposed to compile for Epstein, he mentions David Hansen among others. So I've already informed him about you and so on and so forth. He makes realistic robot heads here. David Hansen became known through Sophia. We can see her here at the top of the picture. The first humanoid robot, which from today's perspective already looks totally crappy again. But that's a
actual given name, but because Sophia is a symbol of wisdom.
Exactly. Well, and Ben Goertzel also writes directly to David Hansen. Yes, hello, I spoke with Epstein, and he would be very interested in having you build a humanoid robot specifically for him. And at the bottom, he also goes on to write, if the Epstein robot should be built, it will be a truly immense pleasure for me to use OpenCog to make its IQ substantially higher than that of the actual person Epstein, chewing cud. And that was already back in 2013, which was only roughly 13 years ago from today. Here, people argue about how brilliant he was. Well, at least he couldn't write. That means it's hard to translate the gibberish he wrote to the scientists. But of course, it could also have just been laziness. I didn't want to withhold this email from you. It is an email between Boris Nikolic and Jeffrey Epstein. Boris Nikolic is the man who served as Bill Gates' scientific advisor. He also took on a variety of secretarial duties and meticulously planned all the major events for Bill Gates. This went on for quite some time. In this instance, Jeffrey Epstein is complaining to Boris Nikolic about what an incredibly arrogant jerk he believes Gates is, mainly because he is always leaving everyone hanging. Yeah, so he organizes the events, then people come, they promise him all sorts of things, a lot of money, and in the end, they're just left hanging. They don't even get a thank you or anything. And Warren Buffett and Bill Gates get all the recognition. So, and now he's writing to Boris Nikolic saying, look, this needs to be organized differently. Yeah, the people, they need something. Yeah, give them something like a new Amex or a new plastic card. Yeah, or, perhaps some helpful free tax advice and so on. But the absolute best thing you could do would be if you organize these people, your donors basically, in some sort of formal brotherhood. Then he writes down here, yeah, they can be formally initiated into the ancient brotherhood. It could be incredibly mysterious, complete with flickering wax candles, long dark robes, and heavy silk blindfolds, and so on. So he actually suggests to Nikolic to build up an inner circle, mainly for the purpose of extracting a vow of silence from them in a kind of ceremony and initiation ritual.
That's an incredibly fascinating aspect of his life that he basically founded his own secret society. Do we know exactly how it all originally came about? In some email, if I recall correctly, he said, yeah, should we let him into our secret society, I think? So can we conclude from that he really did found it? Well, he himself was also in several others, but can we conclude that from this?
Yeah, well, he himself never part of a brotherhood. Rather, when he had anything to do with brotherhoods, it was more as a founder, as an initiator to keep people somehow on a long leash, or rather on a short leash. For him, it was all theater and show, but because he knows it works, because the elite are so obviously into that kind of thing, since it's elitist, he used it. And yes, there is a particularly secret society where I think only ever there are currently 12 living members in existence, the Zodiac, which also happens to be headquartered in New York. And you are officially appointed to a position there for the rest of your life. And when one dies, a new member is brought into the circle. And Epstein was actually specifically asked about this once because someone had just passed away about a particular person, whether he would be suitable for the Zodiac. So why they would choose to consult Epstein about this, so to speak. Exactly why they would seek his advice, I do not know. I can
Imagine that he was involved in higher secret societies and was given assignments by them. He did say that he worked for the Rothschilds, that he asked them.
This quote that he works for the Rothschilds has also been presented a bit out of context so far, because it's always consistently portrayed and framed as if it was some direct, aggressive kind of threat or bragging directed at Peter Thiel. But if you look very closely at all the correspondence and the surrounding context, you realize that Peter Thiel and Epstein were actually discussing how best to get a loan for a highly specific and complex project from a particular bank. And they talked about how to present as much credibility, that is, creditworthiness and trustworthiness, as possible to the bank. So to speak, present themselves. And it was precisely in this specific context that Epstein wrote to him saying, Peter Thiel, as you are likely already aware, I represent the Rothschild family. So he simply used that claim as a strategic basis for his argument with the bank. It was not actually directed at Peter Thiel himself. In my opinion, that's been completely misrepresented.
Yeah, but interesting. But that actually serves to make it even more likely that he was truly representing them. because you can't just make a claim like that to a bank.
Yeah, so factually, that is absolutely true. Here is something also quite interesting, since we are talking about Peter Thiel, a specific email from back in 2014. You are free to invite anyone to the ranch. Jeffrey Epstein writes to Peter Thiel, Hoffman Zuckerberg, bring along whoever you find amusing from politics or Hollywood. So that was basically the direction it was going. Politics, Hollywood, Silicon Valley. It's redundant. He didn't even need to mention that. But who do we have here? So here we have meetings at the ranch between Peter Thiel, Zuckerberg. About those two, I don't even need to say anything. I don't think I need to tell your audience much. Reid Hoffman, one of the first investors in Facebook, founder of LinkedIn, also a pretty big shot. And of course, the already convicted sex offender, Jeff Rapsy. They're meeting here at the ranch, and you can really see how very remote it is. Isolated? Yeah, there is really nothing for miles around, except for the Zorro Ranch, and it even has its own airport. But not
It's not all that far from Area 51, but you probably didn't look into that yourself now, did you? I'll make a video about that sometime.
Yeah, Jeffrey Epstein and the UFOs are also quite interesting. You can really conduct research in any direction and you'll always find something. But it is truly fascinating to observe the diverse kinds of people he constantly interacted with. So we see him with all the big influential names from Silicon Valley, including super wealthy tech investors like Reid Hoffman or even the prominent Nicole Junkermann. He essentially always invested other people's significant capital, so to speak, directly into his own personal projects. He always said he wasn't even a billionaire, he was just a small fish. Yeah, he moved billions back and forth, but those billions belong to other people. And yes, there are indeed several emails available. I can certainly give you a bit more insight into them now, just to sketch this whole situation out in much broader strokes for you and really show you what happened. He then sits down and writes a detailed message to Joscha Bach and also to several other people involved in the project. Michael Riley, who is also a researcher who worked with Seth Lloyd on quantum communication while at MIT, he wrote to them saying, I would truly appreciate it if you both could take a moment out of your day and compile a list for me of innovative and groundbreaking ideas. You can spend some time brainstorming a few ideas. It doesn't really matter. Just allow your creative imagination to run completely wild. And then this Michelle writes back, yeah, well, you should definitely consider starting up your very own intelligence agency here. Also, you could look into things like various types of scientific salons and so on. Maybe also on Little St. James. Then she writes here in parentheses, experimentation with philosophers and scientists. So conducting experiments on isolated and remote islands. Yeah, philosophy, science, and discovering more about various complex physiological processes. And at the very end of her message, she also writes, how about high-profile island orgies? That is, island orgies with very wealthy and influential people. And then she writes here, but I have a strong suspicion that you may already have that covered. So I'm probably not telling you anything new. You've probably already done that anyway. So it's also entertaining to go through this email exchange, to read it, because it actually gives you insight into how they think. It's genuine and absolutely authentic communication, unless you make the assumption it's all AI generated, which I don't, since no one has come forward to deny it. No one is saying, that's not true, I didn't write that.
Yeah, so they probably discussed other things as well. Face to face, things you just don't find in the emails, but it's pretty crazy what you can already find in the emails. That's how I would put it.
Yes, for example, in the year 2016, when Chino Yu, who is a distinguished professor at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University, and whom I also personally consider to be a part of the inner circle of this Brooklyn project, was commissioned by Epstein to procure people for him. People with special abilities, that is savants, individuals with island talents, people who have telepathic abilities, or especially remarkable memory skills. He wanted to study them, and Gino Ju was tasked with that. And here he is seen in the process of carefully drafting an email to the assistant, specifically inquiring about the exact time it would be okay to install the VEEF in his apartment located in Manhattan tomorrow. When you read that part, you can't help but stop for a moment and wonder to yourself, what exactly is that supposed to be? Is that a water purification system or what? No, that's In 2016, a device like this at the bottom of the picture, a VR setup with EEG. And this EEG in turn was connected to computers and so on for brainwave monitoring and so forth. And it served two purposes. On the one hand, they wanted to carefully investigate how virtual reality impacts and influences the human brain. And they also experimented to see whether brainwaves could, in turn, influence the virtual reality. So even back in 2016, which is already 10 years ago, they were experimenting with these things. Of course, today you can buy something like a Galaxy Quest at MediaMarkt. A full 10 years ago, that was considered to be some seriously high-end elite stuff. Obviously, it already existed, but just not for the consumer market. That was reserved solely for the people
in the preparation phase, during which activities did some victims have to put something on?
Unfortunately, there was no exchange about that via email. But here's another interesting thing. Brian Bishop, you simply have to introduce him when it comes to the Brooklyn Project. He is a professional scientific researcher who is also actively involved in the field of CRISPR research. From George Church, and CRISPR research, to put it briefly, is essentially a very precise DNA scissor. Before, it wasn't possible to modify DNA so precisely and really with such exactness. That is exactly what CRISPR research is all about. And now, this man, Brian Bishop, had the brilliant idea to experiment with CRISPR research on human sperm. So he basically modified the DNA of the sperm while it was still within the man's testicles. That was kind of his unique thing. And Epstein thought that was absolutely fantastic. He said that's truly and absolutely brilliant. You can actually create a customized designer baby, but the whole intricate process from the initial conception to, well, at the point of conception, you probably assisted with the genetically modified sperm, but the pregnancy and everything else involved is completely normal, so it doesn't stand out at all, so to speak. And that is precisely why he gave Brian Bishop a significant amount of money to fund a specialized laboratory located in Ukraine. As it turns out, Brian Bishop actually did have several conversations with Jeffrey Epstein, and they said, well, what I'm planning here isn't exactly legal. Of course, we have to comply with American laws. Even abroad, as Americans, we have to follow American laws. But in the end, there was an exception in Ukraine. Epstein provided the funding for a biolab in Ukraine for Brian Bishop to carry out this CRISPR research on mice. There's also an extensive amount of email correspondence about this, but I just don't have it here in this document at this particular moment. I refer you to my lecture, which I'll give at some point. Or the book. Yes, exactly. Or here again, this was one of those Sunday meetings at Martin Nowak's Institute. Martin Nowak is the one, and then they met. Here is Xavier, a dedicated cancer researcher. John de la Parra, a creative food designer. And of course, the philosopher Joshua Bach. Consider Larry Summers, who served as the Secretary of the Treasury under President Obama, but who is also known as a very wealthy investor who frequently invested in such high-risk ventures. And also the former head of the prestigious MIT Media Lab, Joe Ito. So these were not just two ordinary criminals from the chapel. Larry Summers is very important because he also played a role in the founding of Facebook and Google. He is a very important figure. And of course, he also strongly connects the tech industry with Epstein and thus with the cabal. Exactly. Now, I actually have something else to show you. Right there, Jeffrey Epstein is seen asking Joshua Bach if he has ever heard of a company called Nectom, a company founded by Robert McIntyre. It basically promises to make the mind immortal. Of course, Epstein was immediately like, hey, what is that? He immediately writes to Bach, do you know them? And then Bach replies to the message by saying, I've heard of Ed Boyden before, but I have never actually met the man personally. Sam Altman has a contract there, but beyond that fact, that is really all I know about it. And later, about a week after that, he writes back, okay, I was in San Francisco now. I took some time to check the whole thing out, and I finally met with McIntyre. This Nectomy company, it's really just a two-man show, and they basically just make a digital mental copy of your neural tissue. Whether that's actually useful, I really doubt it. At the moment, It looks more to me like they're serving a small market for transhumanist funerals. You really can't make any money with that. They're not earning anything from it. And what they're promising is all just hypothetical. But he composed a letter to him explaining that their research could be exceptionally valuable and significant for the market. High-end tissue preservations for forensic medical diagnostics and neuroscience research. So for the fields of forensic medicine and neuroscience, this nectomy research is extraordinarily compelling and full of potential. But this two-man show do not seem to fully grasp or realize that themselves. They offer transhumanist funerals. So much for Bach's assessment regarding nectomy. So whenever something came up that fit into this world of immortality, life extension, and so on, they very immediately investigated it further. They really did socialize and mingle with the creme de la creme of the global elite. Whether it was a renowned esoteric guru like Dean Radin, who was the head of the Institute for Noetic Sciences and wrote a wide range of parapsychology books, or whether it was Robert Sheldrake, who also exchanged 800 emails with Epstein. So they basically tried to gain insights in every possible direction.
Yeah, I actually found that very interesting in general. These are the people who tell us that all of this is esoteric nonsense, but they themselves have been deeply involved with these metaphysical matters. Yeah.
I have actually managed to locate the email after all. The email is from Brian Bishop, who essentially wrote a message stating, yeah, this will finally allow us to raise our self-funded garage biology to a professional level where the first birth of a genetically engineered human designer baby will soon take place. So that is basically the response when Epstein finally provided him with the money.
Yeah, then it seems he actually got to work. At least one victim reports that they somehow woke up in a mysterious laboratory setting. She described being completely disoriented about where she was and strongly suspected that her reproductive eggs had been individually and surgically extracted by the captors. I think several people said that, but I'm not entirely sure right now. But so did they? It is quite likely that they have probably already tried that directly, yes.
At least here, quite openly, already with mice. The various procedures conducted with mice testing, for example, in a laboratory located in Ukraine, this micro. In Czechia, he carefully examined the sample, yes. So we'll get back to that in a moment. Abuse and experiments, isn't there perhaps some kind of underlying connection or relationship there? It is perhaps also worth considering the possibility that what we generally define and label as abuse might also encompass this specific underlying element. That perhaps it wasn't just about sexual abuse or, so to speak, the act of pimping, or about creating compromat, but additionally, or perhaps even primarily, a matter of something else entirely. About gaining insights into the question, what is consciousness? And of course, that went fully into this MK Ultra research, into control. So they wanted to study consciousness in order to be able to control it. If you want to understand it and recreate it in order to make it immortal, then inevitably along the way, you also end up controlling consciousness. That's a nice side effect. Yes.
We should probably take another look at the victims, examine their statements more closely. Many still haven't dared to say whether some of these were really consciousness experiments. What do people allow to be done to them and in what situations and so on. And of course, he also took advantage of it for himself. Even if he basically has an insight into how to influence people, naturally he uses it for his own purposes as well. Yes.
So there is a lot of email correspondence where they talk about their, I'll just refer to them as victims, or rather test subjects. For example, there is the documented case of a man named Jason who was attending a conference in Cuba back in 2014. He wrote to Chino Yu saying that while he is somewhat grateful for this consciousness work, for receiving this push in awareness, now his whole life is in ruins. All his friends are gone, his job is gone, everything is gone. And now he would like some advice. So not only is everything now in ruins, but they also left scorched earth behind with many people. The most famous, well, maybe not famous because no one knows about it. However, perhaps the most fascinating and significant example to consider is Maria Trakova. She served as a prominent and influential leader of the youth movement known as Nashi. That was Putin's youth movement. In 2013, Trukova was 22 years old. She is very well known in Russia. There, everyone knows her by her nickname, Putin's Kiss, because she once kissed Putin in public. In any case, this Trukova completely fell into the clutches of the Epstein network. And they did some serious brainwashing with her. Chinuyu always called it consciousness work. But it wasn't coaching or anything like what you might imagine. It was some real hardcore brainwashing. And this Trukova was completely brainwashed too. Over the years, they kept talking about Masha, as they called her, and how much progress she was making. And it got to the point that by around 2018, 2019, in terms of consciousness, she had already reached the point where she herself had invested hundreds of millions in Silicon Valley and had advised on apps that were featured in NPR interviews. So she basically went from being the original guinea pig or victim to rising up within this network herself. And Chino Yu officially certified that in terms of consciousness, she possessed the most profound awareness he had ever mapped through any of his methods in any person. Well, so I don't really get much out of that. I also can't do anything with this kind of categorization. He divided it into 5 levels of consciousness. He said that most people are at level 1. The interesting ones are those at level 2. And at level 3, there are only a handful. Levels 4 and 5 are completely theoretical. And that's how they try to categorize people. And I have a brief concluding summary here, a small closing graphic. I'll just take us all the way forward to the year 2019. That's when Joscha Bach sent a message to the assistant, "Dear Leslie, regarding our upcoming meeting in Davos." The WEF 2019 was coming up, and Chino asked me about it. He would be most happy if, and I know that behind what is written there, even though it starts with an S, it's actually Masha hiding behind it. So he would be very pleased if, so Masha wants to join in. Yes, she wants to come to the WEF as well. And then it was also about flying to Marrakech afterwards, and then from there flying to the island. And Gino Yu also writes, Leslie Croft, yes, and I will also have my own shaman with me. And another psychonaut who grows his own mushrooms. So at this meeting after the WF in Davos, it was specifically about gaining experiences with psychogenic mushrooms. There was a lot of email correspondence beforehand with Ken Jordan, who is the owner of Alchemist Kitchen, which is this huge weed and mushroom shop in New York, a really upscale place. That's where Chino, Yu, and Epstein stocked up on all kinds of mushrooms so they could experiment a bit on the island. And that should take place after the WEF meeting in 2019. And Epstein, Peter Thiel, also asks, hey, where are you right now? Are you in Europe? Yes, then, writes Peter Thiel. Oh, come on. I haven't been to Davos since 2013. And right now I am reporting live on Global Station. Just over. So where are you in February? Yes, first I'm in New York, the Caribbean of the month, then in Europe. Maybe we can meet up somewhere in California in March. So Epstein was obviously interested in having Peter Thiel join him on this Davos, Marrakesh, and island trip somehow. But that never happened. 2019 was the end of the line. Epstein disappeared from the scene. And today we are dealing with a Peter Thiel who ultimately, he is the one who continues the thoughts, the ideas, the research findings, all the things I associate with the Brooklyn Project, and keeps bringing them more and more into reality.
And that was the Brooklyn Project. So formalize that now. It's basically, is it possible that it could still exist? Or has it basically been cut off now? I mean, it probably wasn't a company with that name.
Well, it is often compared to the Manhattan Project of the 1940s. But what exactly is the most obvious difference? It is that the Manhattan Project was fully government funded and had a very clear goal, largely due to the pressure of the ongoing war, which is very easy to place historically. The Brooklyn Project itself was not a government organized project that arose out of absolute necessity, out of historical necessity, but rather it was a private initiative based on the original idea of Epstein. But in terms of historical dimension, namely with the intention to achieve AI, to accomplish this task, to create it, he ultimately did draw a comparison of its historical dimension to the research of the atomic bomb. And while you can certainly argue about that, yes, it is absolutely historically relevant. And it is remarkable that they actually did this at a time when, and Goezel writes this in App Style 2008 as well, that he expresses surprise at the fact that neither Microsoft nor Google nor the US military are even remotely researching AI. The only ones doing so are a few old MIT guys like Minsky and Abelson, but they are more about, well, so they were still thinking in a very mechanistic way, so to speak. And in 2008, Goezel was obviously one of the few who truly believed that this would one day be possible, but no one wanted to fund him. And then Epstein came along, he allowed himself to be convinced. He obviously also understood what Goezel was saying. And if you were to ask for my opinion on the matter, looking through these networks operating in the background and also through the steady flow of money into CRISPR research, the app, which was one of the first to receive substantial financial investment, particularly in the field of robotics, which has truly made massive quantum leaps today, even if it is currently less the Americans and more the Chinese who are leading the way, but also in terms of gaining knowledge and AI, which is really the primary buzzword of our time. It seems to me that Epstein was actually one of the early pioneers in all these diverse fields of research. And we don't even know what we don't know, so to speak. We don't know what we don't know, except that it's probably a lot that we don't know. And when I look at what they were willing to do for their research, then I don't consider fantasies like the island of Dr. Moreau or something like that to be fantasies anymore. I'm pretty sure that things like that actually took place. What very few people know, for example, is that Epstein's Island had a submarine harbor. It was underground. It was endlessly underground. There were all sorts of things planned there. At the Zorro Ranch, which we saw earlier, he wanted to set up a designer baby farm. And he was looking for women. I mean, it's common knowledge. That's why, yes, Epstein was actively searching for young women. Tell me something really new. But for what? Just for the abuse? No, he was actively searching for suitable women to give birth to his children, among other things for himself. For example, Epstein had the idea of cloning himself, but then, of course, you need women to carry the children.
Hopefully he didn't succeed.
Well, there are emails, one from 2011 and one from 2014, I believe. In 2011, Sarah Ferguson wrote to him, congratulating him on his child. In 2014, he even received congratulations for his twins. Officially, he had no children.
Well, now that is absolutely all right then. The question is how they are being raised now, so to speak. I mean, as children, we are innocent at first. This essentially implies that they could just become entirely ordinary individuals. But you also know it could be that there is someone watching over them from above. And that one of them, one of ours, the president in 30 years, yes.
Do you know the film, Voice of the Press?
Yes, I know it. I am fully aware of it, but I may have only seen it before just once.
Really old film, I think even from the 80s or something. And in it, Hitler was cloned 16 times.
We
are then in some kind of 70s reality, 16 of them running around as teenagers. And some guy uncovers it and tries to track them down and then wants to kill them or something like that. Yeah, but that's actually the direction it goes in. So we're no longer in the times when all of this was science fiction, even if it sounds like it. Epstein conducted a great deal of research, and many concepts that were once science fiction were actually brought into reality. CRISPR research is part of that, and even Joshua Bach said, oh, stop that stuff. It's the most advanced weapon of mass destruction there is. So CRISPR research was, in his view, something you should keep your hands off. Even Joshua Bach thought that went too far. But for Epstein, nothing was too far. Yeah, I don't think it works the way they imagine. My impression is also kind of that you can clearly observe from the emails that they were not even remotely close to actually implementing the things they had envisioned for the future. For example, they all want to upload their consciousness somewhere and basically live forever. I don't think that works at all. And if it had certainly worked, you would probably see some kind of clear sign of it in the emails. So naturally, the transhumanists have their own ideas. On the one hand, they already have the metaphysical level is actually the more important one here. It's just that they're not programmable machines. They really should have realized that, but somehow they still seem to be trying anyway. And I think it's absolute nonsense to believe that it's possible to upload a consciousness somewhere. And you can actually tell that they haven't managed to do it. I would agree with that 90%, but I actually no longer rule it out completely. They really did have some fascinating insights as well. So from savant research, they were already able to conclude that consciousness definitely doesn't have to be stored locally because savants can do things they've never learned. That means there must be a central computer that savants somehow have access to through a brain injury or something else. That was one of their conclusions. So
Not local means that it doesn't actually take place in the brain. Yes,
exactly.
in the morphogenetic field and in the Akashic records or something like that, that's not really so centralized anymore. So I wouldn't call it a central computer. It's not centralized in that sense. So you actually don't have access
to it. Yes, but that's exactly it. There is actually something like a kind of universal computer. It's like a central brain, so to speak. And our individual brains are just antennas that are basically connected to it. But we all access the same central computer. And with savants, it's due to a brain injury or a congenital defect. Somehow, they have constant access to it, which of course then has a huge impact on life as an avatar, so to speak, especially in terms of social skills, because this constant connection to the central computer makes a lot of things seem unimportant. And of course, it causes a kind of overstimulation reaction. That was their theory. They then asked Stuart Hammerhoff, who is an anesthesiologist, Summer, how is that actually possible? You inject an anesthetic, and within seconds, consciousness is gone. The body functions perfectly, you're alive, and to an outsider, there's no visible difference except that you're simply not there mentally. But what is that? Where does consciousness suddenly go? How can you just switch it off like that? They found that remarkably fascinating. And together with Stuart Hammerhoff, collaboratively developed the microtubule theory and so on. So they were already pioneers in scientific fields that are now at the cutting edge of research. That's really what I'm trying to say with this. I'm not trying to say here that there was some secret conspiracy project to enslave humanity. One could interpret the Brooklyn Project that way if you exaggerate, but that's not my interpretation. What I'm saying is that here we were dealing with a project which, in terms of its historical dimension, ultimately is comparable to the Manhattan Project because there's not much difference between the atomic bomb and artificial intelligence. Both are weapons of mass destruction. You can also use AI for good things, just like you can with nuclear power. So here, groundbreaking research was simply conducted, something was developed and analyzed that has had an incredibly profound historical impact on all of humanity. And I only wrote the book for that reason, because for me, it's a history book. Knowing how relevant it ultimately is, how far they got, others should be the judge of that. And I wouldn't have written the book if even a single blog post on the internet, whether in Spanish, English, or German, had mentioned the Brooklyn Project. That alone would have been enough for me not to write the book. To be honest, I'm quite surprised because it's not something I just made up myself. I wasn't the one who gave it that specific name. Rather, this packaging, this historical comparison with the Manhattan Project was something they themselves made. And after all, we're talking about Marvin Minsky here. Yes, Joshua Bach and Hal Abelson and Ben Gortzel, these are not just anybody. And well-known names like Noam Chomsky or Dmitry Itzkov, I haven't even really mentioned them here yet. They are mentioned in the book. And if I've managed to pique your curiosity, then of course I can only recommend the book.
Yes, I can only highly recommend it to you as well. And now I also do my work in English because I talk about things that no one has uncovered or explored so far. And now you do too. So I'll probably translate this into English as well so that the rest of the world can learn about the Brooklyn Project. Thank you very much, Frank Hofer.
The thanks are mine, dear Ollie. See you soon.
That sounds absolutely wonderful.